We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara, Meseches Yoma. This is Yoma Daf 50b. Gemara here is bringing another proof from a question of Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar asks, "Ledivrei ha'omer par Yom HaKippurim Karban Yachid." He asks, according to the one who says that the power of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is a private carbon, Osa Tmura, Oeno Osa Tmura. Can you make a Tmura by this carbon, or can you not make Tmura by this carbon? And so the Gemara's proof is as follows: Lav Mechlal Di'ikol Man Da'amar D'Tzibor. Doesn't that question itself imply that there is a Man Da'amar that holds that the power of the Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur is a carbon tzibur? He's saying according to the one who says it's a carbon yachid. That implies someone says it's a carbon tzibur. So the Gemara says, "Lo, no, that's not the implication. Mechlal Di'ikol Man Da'amar D'Shutfin." The implication is that some opinions hold it's a carbon hashutfin, as we said before, not necessarily a carbon tzibur. And the Gemara continues, Gufa, returning to the statement we just had before. Boy, Rebbe Lazar asked as follows: Ledivrei ha'omer par Yom HaKippurim Karban Yachid. According to the one who says the power of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is a private carbon, Osa Tmura, Oeno Osa Tmura. Is there a halach of Tmura, or is there no halach of Tmura? So the Gemara says, "My kami boile." What even is the question over here? And the Gemara explains, "Ibasar makdish azlinon, ibasar mischaper azlinon." The question is, do we follow the one who was makdish, who sanctified the carbon, or do we follow the one who is getting the kapara from the carbon? And Rashi over here explains, "My kami boile havadai pshitolon de echav hakohanim miskaper bo." It's obvious to us that the brethren, the kohanim of the Kohen Gadol, they're all going to get a kapara from this carbon. The carbon hashutfin enos and tmur. It's also obvious that a carbon that belongs to a number of people, to partners, there's no halach of tmura. So the Gemara is asking, what even is the question over here? Of course there's no tmura. So the Gemara says, "Inema ibasar makdish azlinan le'inyan temura." Maybe when it comes to temura, we follow the person who was makdish. V'hay yochid akdashay. And over here, in this case, the Kohen Gadol was an individual. He's the one that was makdish the carbon. D'mishal lohuba, he brings the carbon from his own money. V'lo mishal shutfis, it's not brought from partners. Ibasar mischaper azlinan, or do we go by the mischaper? V'harbe mischaper bo, and many people are getting a kapara. All the kohanim are getting a kapara through this carbon. So maybe that's what the question is. But the Gemara says that's obvious. Pshit, that's obvious to basar mischaper azlinan. We do follow the mischaper when it comes to the issue of temura. Diyama Rabbi Avo Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Avo said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Hamakdish Mosif Chomesh, the one who sanctifies the carbon, that's the one who adds a Chomesh. V'hamischaper Osaba Temura, it's the mischaper who's the one who makes the Temura. V'hatorah Mishalo Ashal Chaveiro, someone who takes off Truma from his property on his friend's property. Tovas Hano Ashalo, he gets the payment for the benefit of deciding who to give the Truma to. Rashi over here will explain everything. Rashi first says, Diyama Rabbi Avo Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shlosha Dvarim benosin mishalo es choves chavero. We're talking about 3 items over here that are relevant when a person gives from his own property on behalf of his friend. That's similar to this case. When the Kohen Gadol is giving his own property for the carbon, it's his own money, it's his own animal, but he's giving it as a kapara for all of the kohanim. And the 3 cases are as follows: Hamakdish behemto lotzeis bo chavero chovesh olav. Let's say a person sanctifies his animal for his friend's kapara, for his friend's obligation. Hamakdish have a bailim linyan tosefes chomesh. The one who is makdish the animal is considered the bailim in terms of the halach of adding a 5th. Imhumima ubal lechal. Let's say the situation is that the animal develops a mum, and now you want to redeem the animal. The halach is the bailim, when they redeem, have to add a 5th. Aval imbaham is chaper lechala. If the person getting the kapara wants to redeem the animal, eino tzarach loosif chomesh, he doesn't have to add a 5th. Tegabe chomesh ksivim hamakdish yigoel. By the chomesh it says that the one who sanctifies does the redemption needs to add a 5th. Makdish v'lo mischaper. So in that case, it's the makdish and not the mischaper. That's the idea of all 3 cases over here. We're asking, is it the makdish or is it the mischaper? V'amischaper osa b'tmura. The halach of tmura applies to the one getting the kapara. Meaning, the halach of tmura is, let's say a person takes an animal and says, I want to exchange that animal, which is a carbon, I want to exchange it to another animal. That's the halach of tmura. The halach is both animals are kodesh. That whole halach applies to the one getting the kapara. Aval hamakdishim heimer ba. If the person who was makdish the animal tries to make tmura, eino tmura, there is no chalos of tmura. De'ein memirin b'shal achem. He can't make tmura on someone else's carbon. V'hailaf bailam dideu. He's not considered the bailam with this in this regard. It's the mischaper that's considered the bailam. He's the one that makes tmura. And finally, the last case was if I take off truma on my friend's property, meaning so the person who takes off the truma, even though he's taking from his own property on another person's property, he can decide which kohen to give it to. Let's say someone comes over and says, "I'll pay you to give that truma to my grandson who's a kohen." So in that case, shel zehi shetruma shelo, he's allowed to take the money. He gets the tovas hana. He gets to decide who to give it to, and if there's a payment to give it to a particular kohen, he gets to take that payment. The truma is really his. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, "Ki sechal la'aser es kol maser tuvoscha v'nasato la'levi tola akasav hanesina b'misha masra mishalo." The pasuk says the nesina, the one who gets to decide who to give it to, which kohen gets this, that's the one who's actually doing the giving. That's the one who's the owner of the actual truma. So finally, so that's the last case. So the point over here is, it says clearly we follow mischaper. So if it's obvious we follow the mischaper, what again was the question over here at all? Of course, in this particular case, there's not going to be temura because the mischaper is a bunch of shutfin. And so the Gemara answers, Liolam pshita le debasar mischaper as lina. Of course, Rebbe Lazar, he knew, it was obvious to him that we follow the mischaper. So if we follow the mischaper, again, why should there be temura? In this case, it's multiple people getting the kapara. Gemara explains, here was the question that Rebbe Lazar had. When the Kohanim are getting a kapara, is that bikvius, is that in a permanent fashion? Or is it in a floating fashion? We'll see what Rashi over here explains. Kviyusa means like a normal kapara. If other people separate the carbon, the idea is they get an acquisition of the behema. Those who are getting the kapara are like part owners of this animal. Afkan, so too over here, by the power of the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur, nikno lehen chelek bo. The other Kohanim, they also have a portion in this animal. V'havu lachatas hashutfin l'inyan tmura. And again, it's going to be considered a chatas that belongs to a partnership. As far as tmura, there's not going to be tmura. And Rashi continues, O dilma b'kufya mischapri. Maybe the kapara over here is not that they're part owners. Kilomar ein kaparasum kavua bo. They don't have a fixed, established kapara in this animal. Elet safa al gav kaparas Kohen Gadol. It's floating on top of the atonement of the Kohen Gadol. Kedavar atzaf al pnei hamayim, like something floating on water. Ve'en ha-carbon nikra al shemam. The carbon is not called their carbon. The carbon yachidu, it's really a private carbon. The idea of that option is, really this carbon completely belongs to the Kohen Gadol. It's an individual carbon. There would be tmura. It just happens to be floating along the kapara of the Kohen Gadol is the kapara for the other Kohanim. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof to this question, whether the power of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, whether there's tmura or not. The Brisa says, Chomer bezevach mi betzmura, the Chomer betzmura mi bezevach. There are stringencies by a regular carbon over a tzmura, over the exchange of that carbon, and there are stringencies by the exchange over a regular carbon, and the stringencies are as follows. Chomer bezevach, the Chomer by the carbon itself, shahazevach noheg biyochid ki betzibor, a carbon is noheg whether by a private individual, whether by a tzibor, bedoches ha-shabbos ve'esatoma, it's also docha Shabbos, it's docha tuma, v'yosa tzmura, and also you can make a tzmura, of course, by a carbon. Masha'in came betzmura, all of these things are not true when it comes to tzmura, and chomer betzmura mi bezevach, there's a stringency by tzmura over a carbon, the original carbon, sha'tzmura chala al bal mum kavua, because by a tzmura can be chal even on a bal mum kavua, even when there's a blemish. Ve'ena yotza lechulin, it cannot be redeemed lechulin, ligazes v'liyavin, in order to be sheared and in order to do work with it. Masha'en kein bezevach, and this is not true by a zevach. All of this will be explained by Rashi. Rashi over here says, Chomer bezevach shebot tchilas hektish, meaning the original animal that was sanctified, mi betzmura, there's a stringency over tzmura, shehum rabo, meaning the animal that was exchanged in kedusha from the original, the second animal, that's different than the original animal. Sha'zevach ulekami mefaresh v'azal b'hai zevach mashkachasla. The Gemara later will explain what carbon are we talking about. Well, we're talking about some original carbon and comparing it to a tzmura, comparing it to the exchange. Masha'in kain betzmura, meaning sha'atzmura eina betzibur. Number one, when it comes to tzmura, there is no tzmura by carbon tzibur, as we said earlier. Ve'ena docha Shabbos, also it's not docha Shabbos. She'ein zman kavua, because there's no zman kavua when it comes to a tzmura. Ve'ena osa tmura. Also, you can't take a tmura and make a tmura of a tmura. Techsiv v'ayahu utmuraso v'lo tmuras tmuraso. The halacha of tmura applies by the first tmura, doesn't apply by tmuras tmuraso. And then the Brisa continued with the stringencies of tmura over the zevach. Shat tmura chala al Allah kedushas haguf, because when it comes to tmura, there's a kedushas haguf afilu hibalas mum kavua b'shas hatmura. Even if there's a blemish, a permanent blemish at the time you try to make the tmura, you try to make that hektish. And if you wanted to redeem it, you can only make it go lechulin in terms of shechting it, in terms of eating it. But for example, you're not allowed to now shear the animal and use the shearings. You're not allowed to work the animal. Because there's no difference when it comes to tmura between a tam and a balmum, between one without a blemish and with a blemish. Like it says in the pasuk, Rabbi Tov o Tov berav im Hamer Yomir, talks about tmura, whether it's ra, whether it's tov, it doesn't make a difference. Meaning again, there's going to be a kedushas haguf, even in a situation where it has that mum. But Rashi continues, Masha'ekin bezevach, this is not true by the original carbon. Shazevach, when it comes to a regular carbon, meaning not a tmura, im kadam hekdeshu es mumu, if you have a situation where you sanctified it before it developed a blemish, so then it is taka true. Ein yotze bepidyona lechun ligazes v'liyavid, then in that case you can't redeem it for the purpose of shearing it, for working it, because it says by psula hamikdashin, tizbach v'yachal basar. The pasuk says you sacrifice and you eat it as meat, meaning tizbach v'lo giza basar v'lo cholav, meaning you're allowed to sacrifice it, but you can't use the shearings. You can use the meat, you can't use the milk, you can't work it in that sense. Avol kadam mumo lehekdeisho. But if the blemish would come before you sanctify the animal, again, same like the case of tamur we're talking about before, hareo kemakdash eitzim va'avonim lidmeola. That would be as if you're trying to sanctify wood or stones to be for a carbanola. She'ein kedushas haguf alein el kedushas damim bilvad. There is no kedushas haguf. That's not going on the mizbeach. That just has what's called kedushas damim. The value is hektish. V'yotzin b'pidyonin l'chulin gemurin. In that case, you can redeem it and make it full chulin, use it for anything. Ke'etanan be'bechorus v'shchitas chulin, like it says in bechorus and shchitas chulin. So in other words, the difference is as follows: by tamura, if the mum comes first and then you try to make it tmura, so there is a kedushas haguf, and you can't redeem it for anything you want. You can't redeem it ligazes v'leyavid. But by a regular carbon, if the mum comes first, there's no kedushas haguf whatsoever. It can be redeemed in any fashion. And so now the Gemara analyzes this brisa. Hai zevach hechi dami. When we talk about the original carbon that's not a tmura, what carbon are we talking about? Ilema de yachid. If you say that we're talking in this brisa about a regular carbon yachid, so then mi dachi Shabbos v'tumah, does a regular carbon yachid, is that docha Shabbos and tumah? In other words, the brisa said shazevach noeg b'yachid kivetzivor v'doches haShabbos v'satumah. It says it's docha Shabbos and tumah. What regular carbon yachid is docha Shabbos and tumah? So ela de tzibur. So obviously we're talking then about a carbon tzibur. But if that's the case, miosa tmura. There is no tmura by a carbon tzibur. So we must be talking about a very particular carbon over here. Elo lav de par. Rather, what we're talking about is the power of Yom Kippur. That's exactly what the Bryce is talking about. V'doches haShabbos v'esatumah dekvia leizman. The reason why the power of Yom Kippur is doches Shabbos and tumah is because it has a set time. V'osa tmura. And why is it osa tmura? The carbon yachidu, because it's considered to be a carbon yachid, and it's osa tmura. And this will resolve the question we had before when it comes to the power of the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippur. Is it osa tmura? The answer is yes. And Rashi over here explains Elo lav de par Yom Kippurim. We're talking about the power of Yom Kippur. Noheg betzibur kaviyachid. Now, what does that line in the Brisa mean when it says it's noheg as a public offering and a private? It means the chatosi. It means that's a carbon chatos. The chatos noheg is betzibur, meaning in general a carbon chatos can be noheg biyachid. It can be noheg betzibur. The osa tmura. And the Brisa said it makes tmura. Alma par Yom Kippurim osa tmura. You see from this Brisa that the power of Yom Kippur is going to make tmura, and that should resolve Rebbe Lazar's question. And so the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says, lo, no, we're not talking about the power of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur in this brisa. Rather, be'elo shel Aaron, we're talking about the carbon ayil that Aaron brings. Now, that is certainly an individual. It's a carbon yachid, that's no doubt, and that is a carbon ola. So in that particular case, that's where we say it's osa tmura. We would not say that necessarily by the par. And the Gemara says, hachinam mistabra. It makes sense we're talking about the ayil and not the par. The salka daitach de paro, if you think that we're talking about the par, the bull of Aaron that's brought in Yom Kippur, tmura de par Shabbos Shabbos v'tumah hu lo dachya, that would imply that the tmura of the par is not docha Shabbos and tumah. Ha b'chol makriv karva, but you're going to bring such a carbon b'chol. In other words, if it's not Shabbos, if it's a regular weekday, you would bring that tmura. Ha tmuras chatasi, but the carbon of Aaron, as we said, the par of Aaron is a chatas, so that's a tmuras chatas. And the halacha is tmuras chatas lemisa azla. When you have a tmura of a carbon chatas, you let it go lemisa, you don't offer it. So therefore, we can't be talking about the par of Aaron HaKohen. And the Gemara responds, lo, no, it could be talking liolam paru. It could be talking about the par that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur. Umay tmura. So what does the next part of the brisa mean when it talks about tmura? It doesn't mean the tmura of that particular animal. Shame tmura, it just means tmura in general. In other words, the brisa is comparing the par of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur to general tmura, not to the tmura of the par of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, Yachi, if so, if you're willing to read the brisa that the word tmura just means tmura in general, zevach nami, shem zevach, why not understand that the word zevach in the brisa just means a general carbon? You don't have to have it refer to a specific carbon. So the Gemara says, shem zevach lo katani, the brisa would not be talking about just general zevach. And the Gemara says, mimai, how do you know that the brisa is not talking about a general carbon? Midaktani, because the brisa says, chomer b'tmura, that one of the stringencies of the tmura over the carbon is, shahatmura as we said before, the tmura can be chal even on an animal that's already a mum. It has a permanent blemish, and you're not able to redeem it in order to shear it, in order to do work with it. In other words, the kedushas haguf is chal, and you can't have a full redemption for all purposes. Now, the Gemara says, if you think that in the Brisa, when it talks about zevach, it just means a zevach in general, and the contrast is between, again, the tmura and a general zevach, but there are exceptions in zevach as well. But we have the following examples. We'll take a look at a few Rashis over here. My tmura, shem tmura. Tmura just means tmura in general. Liolam bepar. Really, when we're talking about the carbon, we're talking about the power of the Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur. When it says that the carbon is more strict than the tmura, lava tmura dideka, it's not going on the tmura of the par of the Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur. It just means as follows: chomer bezevach mishem tmura. This particular carbon, the par of the Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur, is more strict than general tmura. Shein lach davar sheshmo tmura docha Shabbos. There's no tmura that's docha Shabbos. Ve'afilu hatmuras hakrebas. Even if you have tmuros that are brought in general, they won't be brought on Shabbos. Gemara says, Yachi, if so, the shem katani, that you're saying it just means in general, zevach nami shem zevach katani. Say the same thing by the carbon. The original carbon is not talking about a specific carbon. It just means if you have an original carbon in general. V'kevan the shem zevach tani tana my duchkach luukme bechad zivcha. What are you forcing it into one particular carbon to tishma minod to v'paro shel Aaron, to say, oh, we're talking about the power of Aaron, or be'elo mayri, we're talking about the ayil of Aaron. Dil malchi kamar tana. Maybe the tana means very simply chomer bedavar sheshmo zevach midavar sheshmo tmura. Something that is a zevach, that's an original carbon, is more strict than a tmura carbon. Sheyesh zevach noeg b'tzibur keviyachid. There are zevachs that can be public carbonas, can be private carbonas. V'yesh zevach shedocha Shabbos. There are zevachs that can be docha Shabbos. Kagon de tzibur or the yachid shezmano kavua. If it's public or if it's a yachid that has a fixed time. V'yesh zevach shos a tmura kagon carbon yachid. There are zevachs that can make tmura like a carbon yachid. And the Gemara responds, shem zevach lo katani. We cannot be talking about zevach in general. Haytana can't be in this brisa. It has to be a specific, because again, as we said, that line in the brisa of chomer b'tmura, shatzmura chalal balmam kavua, that would not apply, that wouldn't work well with shem zevach, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Aleph.